Hello, everybody. It's Kevin Smith here. We'll shortly start the presentation on sex-linked traits in poultry. Um, give people a chance to connect. If someone is online and wants to make a comment just to say that you can hear the message coming through, that would be great, just from my point of view. Hi, folks. I can see that people are just starting to join, so that's good. Uh, what we're going to do tonight is go through a series of PowerPoint slides just on sex-linked traits in poultry. It's a follow-up from the basic genetics presentation I gave a couple of months ago that you'll be able to go back and find still in the Facebook group if you need a refresher on some of the basics. I'll just wait another moment or two for people to join in. One of the good things about using this Facebook Live platform to do it is that people don't have to register or go to a separate platform to do things. One of the negative things, I guess, is that people just join as they come along. So we'll just try and collect a few people together and make a start. So sex linkage in poultry is, as the name suggests, a mechanism where colours or other traits are seen differently in one sex of the bird versus another. So the example slide I have here are a pair of silver leg bars, which are a breed that was created in the 1930s or so to be able to sex the chickens at birth. So that was one of the sort of practical considerations of using these sex-linked traits to, because up to that point, it had either been impossible to sex day-old chicks or people had used vent sexing techniques that had been developed in Japan to do this, and it was a real specialist art. So a group of academics at Cambridge University, led by Professor Reginald Punnett, actually developed a range of auto-sexing breeds, which they used the suffix bar to denote the breed. So there were leg bars, cam bars, road bars, Y bars, and others. So we'll come to that as one of the aspects of sex linkage in poultry. I'm just trying to change my slide and it's just being a bit slow with the Wi-Fi here. So the first thing we need to know to understand how sex linkage works is the basic mechanism of sex determination in chickens, or in fact all birds. And some of you may know that in mammalian species such as humans, we have a XY chromosome system of determining sex, and it's actually the male that determines the sex of the offspring through which version of the X or Y the semen take when during fertilization. In birds, it's the opposite way around in that the female actually determines the sex based on which chromosome goes into the egg and side of things. The uh, so the chromosomes are called Z and W. The male has two copies of the Z chromosome, and the female has one copy of Z and one of the chromosome called W. So in its basic sense, that determines the sex of the offspring. The Z chromosome also carries the genetic code for several traits. And because of this, there are a number of these traits, barring silver or gold color, chocolate color, feather growth, some black leg color traits are carried on this Z chromosome. And this is where the aspect of sex linkage comes in, because males have two copies of this code for these traits. And so the example I've put here is the barring gene. And so the male, because like any other chromosome, has two copies, he can have three forms of the trait. He can have the dominant allele, which is the capital letter. And just to remind people that usually when there's two forms of a gene, which is what we call the alleles, one tends to dominate either completely or incompletely over the other one. So, and the dominant version gets a capital letter in genetic convention, and the recessive version gets the lowercase letter. So in this case here, the male, as I said, can have two copies of the barred gene. He can have one copy with the capital B, small b, or he can have two copies of the non-mutant form, which is the non-barred version, which is two copies of the lowercase b. The female, because she only has one copy of the Z chromosome, can only have one copy of any gene that's coded on this Z chromosome. And so she is what we call in genetics terms hemizygous. So she only has half the gene complement because she only has one copy of the chromosome. So in this case, we denote the forms that she can be with either she has one copy of the capital letter here, and I'm just going to see if I can turn on the laser pointer to make it easier. So she has one copy of the capital letter B and so is barred, or she has one copy of the lowercase letter. So, and then we denote the fact that she doesn't have the second copy, just the missing version with the hyphen there. So if we just move to talk about this in terms of some traits, and this example was one I've taken off the web, but it's an example of how this sex linkage works in breeding, and it's using the sex-linked red, or which is a silver and gold aspect. And we'll talk a bit about silver and gold and how this is used in commercial poultry, but also in exhibition poultry. So as I mentioned, the female has one copy. In this case, she has the capital S, which is the dominant version, which is silver. And the male has two copies, but he has the recessive version, which is not silver, which is why it's here, which is actually gold. And so if you mate these birds together, what happens here is that each of the sons of this cross have a version that sits on the Z chromosome of the capital S for silver, and they get that from their mother. And as I said, it's the female that determines sex here. So what you can see is they get this capital S and there and there. And from their sire, they must get the lowercase s, the gold variant. So we can see each of those has one capital, one lowercase, one capital, one lowercase. And the female from here has to get the W or the blank version, which comes through here, but on the Z chromosome, they have to get that from their sire, so they get the lowercase s. So you have this split here where the males are a silver version and the females are gold. So this is what we call a sex-linked cross. And this sex-linked cross actually changed the way that commercial egg production and the commercial egg industry took over and how this was developed from the 1980s onwards. Those of us that are a bit older will remember in most backyards in Australia from the 1950s through to the 1980s, we had black chooks or we had white chooks of various crossbreds as the egg-laying birds. But the advent of this crossing changed the way things were. And I just thought the slide was in a different order, but I'll come to that in a moment. So if we just talk about silver and gold again for a moment, just with some examples here that are not just cartoons. This is the case with the male, where the male can have two copies of the gene. And so with a gold male, such as this black red here, you can see the gold part you can see on him is the hackle here and on the shoulders here. The silver male that is in its pure form has two copies of the capital S and is this nice clean silver duckwing variant here. But the silver is not actually fully dominant over gold. So when the male has has one copy of the silver gene and one copy of the gold version, we get what we call in exhibition terms a gold duckwing. So you can see that this pale straw color in his hackle sits between these two extremes here. There's different breeds, but the color is an example. And this is one of the reasons why, particularly in modern game, where colour is much more important than in Old English game or some other game breeds, breeders are very reluctant to cross between the silver duckwing and the black red version here, because even though there's only one gene difference, this straw coloured hackle would be seen to be very bad in the duckwing male. And so I actually thought this slide was one previous, so my apologies for that. But this is the commercial aspect that I was talking about, was this ubiquitous red hybrid layer, which is either an iso brown or a highline. And this again is the result of that silver gold cross. So what you can see here is the gold or red female and the silver cockerel. So all of a sudden, instead of having specially trained chicken sexes, basically anyone could go through and sort the day-old chickens very easily. So there's a real commercial aspect to the silver gold sex linkage in poultry. So I just want to come back to the exhibition sense for a moment and demonstrate what this means. And we've got an example here of the sex-linked cross, which is a gold male over a silver female. And in this case, what happens is if you cross the gold male with the silver female, and in an Old English game sense, and in this example, the male is a black red or black breasted red, and the female here is silver duckwing. And the progeny of this cross can either be sexed at birth or early on based on the colours of the chickens. So all of the males, and this is the example that I gave earlier with silver and gold again, all of the males end up being this silver, but what we would call an impure silver or a gold duckwing. But they're basically, in genetics terms, a silver, and all of the females are gold, so would be partridge. There can be some intermediate colors, but this is the main effect that we see. And so this gold by silver cross is sex when the male is gold. And I'll show some examples with other breeds in a moment. It's important to remember with these crosses that the reverse doesn't work. It is not sex linked. And so if we took a silver duckwing male and crossed him with the black red or partridge female, so silver male times gold female, what happens here is that the silver male has two copies of the silver gene, as we mentioned. The female just has the one copy of the gold. So we get a range of progeny colors there. So we don't see the sex linkage that we were talking about. So if we take some examples of the other breeds of gold males, and I just want to put some examples here where gold is basically the red color that you see, and it doesn't matter which background it's on. So the um, example that we have here, a classical orange-red Old English game, so a birchen derived bird or a crow-winged bird, he is also a gold-laced Wyandotte, a speckled Sussex, a brown-red pekin, and this is a blue-red modern game. So it doesn't matter whether the bird is black or blue, but these are all examples of gold males in different breeds. You could also put a Rhode Island Red in there as another example of a gold male. And here are some examples of silver females, and some are obvious. So we have a silver-laced Wyandotte, a silver Seabright, but not all the silver colours are obviously and called silver. So a light Sussex is also a silver bird. She's not a white bird with black spots or neck hackle. She's actually a bird where the black is restricted, but she's silver underneath. Likewise, here we have the silver hackle on a birchen Japanese, or grey in Old English. We have a silver wheaten, so you can hear this is a wheaten bird with this silver cap on her head, and a coronation Sussex. So again, it doesn't matter whether it's black or blue or lavender. What matters is the silver colour that comes here. So in all of these breeds, or crossbreeds, if you wanted to, you could make a sex-linked cross with those different colours and different attributes. The next example that I'll have here is the barred gene. And the barred gene is another example where you have the barred male and sorry, I'll just go back a bit. So we have the example where the barred trait is the dominant one, and it's actually the mutation, so it over the non-barred females. What a barring does is turn a black bird into a striped bird, a black-red bird into a creole bird, and barred and cuckoo are actually the same gene. They're just expressed differently. So there's no different genetic basis to that in terms of the main gene at play. The difference is how that gene expresses during feather growth and other aspects. So this is the example here of the black male over the barred female. So in this case, as I've mentioned, the cross is sex linked, so that what we have here is that the female has to give this Z version here. So the sits on the Z chromosome that we discussed at the beginning. She has to give that to all of her sons because all of her daughters get the W chromosome, so the lac, which does not have the copy of the barred gene. So what you can see here is in this cross, the black male over the cuckoo female in this case, all of the progeny males will be barred or cuckoo, and all of the daughters will be black. Now, one of the aspects to that is that you can change this if you're not interested in the black times cuckoo or barred approach. This could be a black-red Old English game, and this could be a Creole female, and the same would apply, that all the males would be Creole in that case, and all the females would be black-reds. The other aspect is that it's also not sex linked in the other direction, in that this male here has he has the barred gene, and will give that to his daughters, and depending on his um, constitution, whether he's got one copy of the barred gene or two, he will either have black daughters or just cuckoo daughters, and he will either have just cuckoo sons or just black sons, but you don't get this split between the sexes. So the number of colors you see in the offspring, whether you just see all cuckoos or a mix of black and cuckoos, depends to whether the male has one or two copies of the bar gene. But what you can see is that you don't get a difference between the sexes, and this is really important. And one of the things that you will often hear is that people will say that the cross works in the reverse direction. And they might say, well, that's worked in my campaigns, or that's worked in my old English game. And it's hard to argue with people's experience, but the most likely aspect of it is that this is a probability game, so they probably haven't hatched enough to actually see the true effect. But the sex linkage only works in this way where, and I'll just go back a slide, where the female has the dominant gene and only one copy of it because that's all she can have, and the male has the recessive gene. So same thing with silver and gold that we talked about before. The female had the dominant gene, the silver, and the male had the recessive gene, the gold. And so that's one of the key tricks about thinking about how to use this in your crossing, and to explain why, either if you want to sex your chickens at an early age, or you want to get exhibition colours of both kinds. And so in this case, if you wanted to get exhibition cuckoo daughters from this cross, you never would. So whereas doing the cross in this direction gives you the full range of possible colours, but as I said, depending on whether the male has one or two copies of the barring gene. The other interesting aspect of the barred gene is that it has a dose effect. And what we mean by that is if a male has one copy of the barring gene and the barring gene restricts black, it doesn't restrict the black as much as if the male has two copies of the barring gene. So this dark barred characteristic here is a sign that in most cases the male only has one copy of the barring gene, whereas this real light color, like the light barred effect, is a sign that the male has two copies of the barring gene. And this happens with a lot of breeds, not so much in Australian Plymouth Rocks, which actually breed true, but that's another story. And one of the things you can imagine here is that if this barring happened on a bluebird and it had two copies of the barring gene, if you can imagine these bars were actually a very light blue, the bird is so washed out that it's almost white. Same thing happens when you have a barred red bird. The red in between here gets lightened, and so by the time you've got two copies of the barring gene on a red bird, it's this really light wishy-washy color, which a lot of people don't like. So it's important when you're thinking about designing your crosses to decide whether that's something you want to see or don't want to see. But yeah, so this is what we call a dose effect. Two doses of the gene, you see this. One dose, you see this. And obviously the female can only have one dose of the barring gene. The next aspect I think that's important with the barring gene to know is that it has a diagnostic head spot in the chickens. These are two cuckoo leghorn chickens, happen to be mine. And what you can see here is this looks like a black leghorn chicken, except it has this spot on its head. This looks like a blue leghorn chicken, except it has this spot on its head. And so you can use this very early on. You don't have to wait to see the barring in the chicken feathers to actually sex these chickens if you designed this as a sex-linked cross. You could go through here and say, I've designed it to be the sex-linked crossed. I had the barred female in the case we used. So if I'd done this as a sex-linked cross, all these chickens with the dot would be cockerels. So you could use that if you wanted to remove the cockerels, but it's just a diagnostic aspect of this. It also works in a pure breeding barred bird. So one where both parents are barred and you're not doing that black or blue times barred cross. But it's pretty strain dependent, and these are some old scientific paper graphs from Plymouth Rocks. And some strains of Plymouth Rocks you can sex at birth very easily, and others are much harder. And the basic premise of this is that in these pure breeding lines of barred birds, the male tends to have at its core a discrete round spot. But what you can see is that, and the female's a bit sort of fuzzy and blurred and hopeless in terms of distinction, but there's a real overlap and it depends on your strain. So one of the reasons this sexing of barred birds that bred true never took off was that you made too many, there were too many incorrect calls in that. But there are, particularly in Plymouth Rocks, exhibition strains that the owners can sex at birth and sex very accurately at birth because they tend to have males like this and females like this. And clearly, if all your males look like this and all your females look like this one, it'd be very easy to tell them apart. But it's what this shows is it's not as straightforward as it sometimes is, and it explains why that, particularly in rocks, some people will say I can sex mine at birth, and others will say, or at hatching, and others will say they can't. The next trait I wanted to touch on in this presentation this evening was chocolate. And chocolate's pretty new to Australia. And I've taken this from a web source. I don't really know much about the page. I was just looking for an appropriate image. And it's different and it's rare in that it's a sex-linked recessive gene. So gold and silver that we've just been talking about, the mutant form was a dominant form. In this case, the mutant form, which is chocolate, is recessive. And what you see here is that because of that difference, you want to have the sex-linked cross. The male needs to be the chocolate version. He needs to have two copies of the recessive chocolate gene to be able to appear chocolate, and the female is black, so not chocolate. And what happens here in this cross is that the male gives a copy of the chocolate gene to his daughters. They have no complementary gene because it's on the Z chromosome again. So the daughters are chocolate and the males are black, but split for chocolate. So they get the black version or the not chocolate version in this case from their dam, from their mother. So that's the one case that I know of that is the reverse to the uh, gold and silver or barred approach where the mutant form, because it's a dominant trait, is in the female. In this case, the dominant trait The mutant trait, the recessive one, is in the male. But if you think about it the other way, the female still has the dominant gene. So the rule is the same regardless. It's just if your target trait is the chocolate version, you need to look at it the other way. But also, it doesn't work in the reverse direction. So the sex-linked color trait only works when the female has the dominant trait and the male has the recessive trait. The last part of the presentation, I did want to make this one a little bit shorter, um, was to talk about auto-sexing breeds. And I touched on these before, and I think it's a shame that they've really mostly fallen out of fashion. They never took off particularly well commercially for two reasons. One was that about the time that they were developed, as I said, mostly at Cambridge University in the 1930s or so, the Japanese chicken sexes actually really started to hit their straps. And a lot of these original auto-sexing breeds, the first one was the Cam Bar, which was a Campine barred Plymouth Rock, and they just didn't have the egg-laying potential of the pure breed White Leghorns or others that were used at the time. So they're a little bit up against it and were a victim, I think, of the advent of vent sexing of chickens. But in this cross, they breed pure, so both sides are barred, so you can see that here. And the other aspects, so you can see the head spot on the male chicken here, the female is actually striped and doesn't have the well-defined head spot. So you're able to sex these chickens at birth, and the you can see that in this stripy wild type chicken, young chicken color pattern, the the spot was really obvious. If you thought about doing this same approach on, say, a Wheaton-based chicken, like you wanted to make there was a attempt to do this in Sussex, and the Sussex version, they actually used brown Sussex and was a brass bar. But if you do it in Rhode Islands or you do it in light Sussex, which are on a Wheaton base, you can imagine a Wheaton chicken, which is a light color, whether it even Rhode Islands, when they're gold, can be very pale. It's very hard to see whether it has a dot or not. And then to be trying to look at shapes of dots on those birds is almost impossible. So what the idea was here was to develop breeds that bred true but could be sexed at birth. And this recipe is in a number of books, or if you look in Exhibition Poultry BYP, so the page you're in now, and look at the breed of the week for leg bars, you'll see this recipe reproduced there. And this is just the example of how you would go about developing any of these breeds from scratch. And as I said, there were Wyandotte versions, there were Sussex versions, there were Campine versions, there were Leghorn versions. And so in this case, you've got non-barred male with the barred female, and you go through a couple of generations of crossing. And it's a recipe here to say that in the first, as you work through, you're keeping the barred versions coming all the way through, and then getting this barred pullets here and the pure barred brown cockerels. So that's the two copies. So they're using that dose effect that we discussed before to identify these two groups, and they became the leg bars. And once you've got those, they breed true, and you don't have to do this again and again. So you could, if you wanted to create and exhibit Y bars, you could take a Wyandotte male and cross to a barred rock female and go through that approach. But the other way you can use this, if you think about it, is I could use this same recipe to create Creole leghorns and go through the approach of starting with a brown leghorn male and a cuckoo female and work through the same approach. And then by the time I got here, we would just say that these are the pure breeding Creole leghorns. So in this case, the Creole males would be that, and I have heard it called a mackerel Creole in the past, but that really fine barred light color. Whereas mostly for exhibition, we actually like this version of Creole in males with a bit more depth of color. But we could go through here and produce a pure breeding Creole Leghorn or Creole Wyandotte or whatever else. So the recipe can be used between breeds and also within breeds. And so, of course, there is more, and I could repeat this with more diagrams. And the two main ones that we see are leg color. And in this case, the black leg is dominant over white. And if the black is on a yellow-legged base, it's willow. And again, people who breed game fowl particularly will see this sex linkage. So, and it explains too from time to time how if particularly people say Wheatons with partridges, we get these dark-legged Wheatons and they end up more on one side of the cross or the other, or how to get rid of them. So again, if you wanted to utilize this as a cross, it's the dominant trait, so you would want the black-legged female over a white-legged male over a black-legged female, and you would get black-legged sons and white-legged daughters. This cross was actually used in some cases with silkies and other things for trying to produce some commercial black fleshed kind of birds with a little bit of success, but it was a bit more of an academic exercise. The other gene that we come across is the slow feathering gene, which again is the dominant trait. And this slow feathering gene is often seen in breeds where we want very precise barring, like Plymouth Rocks and others. So it can be used to sex chickens based on their wing feathers as young chickens, but you have to have that slow feathering gene. It's not just that without that version, then you can't wing sex chickens, which is why, again, some breeds like Plymouth Rocks, which have the slow feathering trait, and anyone who's grown rocks will know that the feather sexing works well. Other breeds like Leghorns or Sussex that don't have that slow feathering gene, it doesn't work. So we could do examples of those, but the main thing to remember is that the recipe's the same. You want the dominant trait on the female side of the cross for the sex linkage to occur. So it's a bit more focused, this presentation, because we were really just talking about sex-linked traits, but I'm happy to try and answer any questions from anyone. Type some into the comment box and I'll just try and take it from there. Thanks, David. So I'm happy to try and answer any questions that people may have, or uh, whether they think this might work in a breed that they're working on. The presentation does get stored, so you will be able to have a look at it and play it again at your heart's content. There are a whole range of resources that you can utilize. But the main thing to remember is this point of saying if you want a sex-linked cross, the dominant gene needs to be on the female side, and the sex linkage does not work way around. So it's a gold male over a silver female, or a non-barred male over a barred female in the examples we gave. So if there are no other questions or comments, I might just end the presentation and thank everyone for listening in. Hopefully, for those of you that find these things new, you might have got a few clues of how you might use this for yourself. For those of us who are a little bit more experienced, hopefully it's just jogged your memory about the things you already knew. So thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening, whatever it is that you're about to do, and we'll talk again soon. Bye now.